Imagine you're traveling through the Tyrolean Alps in the late 19th century. You're looking for something untouched, something primitive and pure, away from the soot and noise of the industrial cities. You expect to find simple mountain folk living in a timeless, picturesque landscape. But when you actually arrive, you find that the world is much more complicated than your romanticised sketches suggested. You find travellers from all over Europe, people speaking different languages, and a culture that is much more modern and interconnected than you ever imagined. This is the setting for Grant Allen's 1898 novel, Linnet, a Romance. It begins with two men, Florian Wood and Will Deverill, who are looking for exactly that kind of mountain escape. Florian is an aesthetic philosopher, a man who lives through his ideas of beauty and art. Will is a bit more grounded, a poet and journalist who is navigating his own sense of purpose. As they wander through the Zillerthal valley, their expectations of a pure Alpine life are immediately challenged by the reality of a working, breathing, modern society. It's in this landscape that they encounter Linnet, or Lina Telser, as she's known then. She's a young milkmaid, but she possesses a voice that is nothing short of extraordinary. When she sings, it isn't just the sound of a peasant girl, it's the voice of a prima donna. She's being mentored by Andreas Horsberger, the local innkeeper. Horsberger is a man of great ambition and even greater pragmatism. He realizes very quickly that Linnet's voice is not just a gift, but a commodity. He believes the thin mountain air is the secret to her vocal development, and he begins to shape her career with a cold, commercial eye. As Will becomes captivated by Linnet's natural, unstudied talent, a tension begins to build between the visitors and the local social structures. There is a sense that Linnet belongs to the mountains, but the world is already reaching out to claim her. She is pursued by two different kinds of men. There's Franz Lindner, a local man who is driven by a mix of romantic obsession and a desperate desire to climb the social ladder, and then there's her cousin, Fridolin. But Linnet herself is caught in a different kind of struggle. She isn't just choosing between men, she's navigating a complex web of economic necessity and religious duty. To provide for her family, and to honour her Catholic faith, she sees marriage to the wealthy and established Horsberger as an inevitability. As the story moves forward, the scale of the narrative expands. Will and Florian move on to Innsbruck, and we see Linnet's career begin to take flight under Horsberger's shrewd management. She is no longer just a girl from the valley, she is becoming a professional. She travels to Innsbruck and eventually to Meran, where her talent becomes a massive commercial asset. During this period, Will and Linnet share a brief, intense connection that hints at what their lives might have been like if social and economic realities hadn't stood in the way. However, the social order is fiercely protective of its boundaries. Rue Palmer, a wealthy American widow and a friend to Will, enters the picture. Rue is a selfless character, but she is also a strategist. She sees the potential for disaster in a romance between a gentleman like Will and a peasant girl like Linnet. She fears that such a connection would ruin Linnet's burgeoning reputation and derail Will's future. To prevent this, Rue persuades Will to leave, effectively severing the connection before it can truly take root. This separation allows Linnet to ascend to the highest levels of international stardom. She sheds her peasant identity and becomes the celebrated diva Signora Casalmonte. But this success is a gilded cage. Horsberger has turned her into a high-performing asset. He controls her diet, her finances, and her social life, all to ensure that the product remains profitable. Linnet's marriage to Horsberger becomes a strategic arrangement, a way to stabilize her status and satisfy the requirements of her social and religious standing. She finds herself trapped between two powerful forces, the greed of her husband and the overwhelming weight of her own Catholic faith. To her love for Will isn't just a social scandal, it's a mortal sin. The setting shifts to the bustling, sophisticated urbanity of London, where Linnet's fame has reached its zenith. She is a global icon, a woman everyone knows but no one truly understands. In private, however, her life is a battlefield. She is a woman living in a state of constant psychological tension, caught between her suppressed passion for Will and the terrifying reality of religious dogma. Andreas Horsberger continues to use the threat of social and spiritual ruin to keep her compliant, acting more like a warden than a husband. Meanwhile, the subplot involving Franz Lindner reaches a breaking point. Driven by jealousy and a desperate failed attempt to gamble his way to wealth in Monte Carlo, Linnet has descended into a life of crime and desperation. He returns to the Tyrol with a singular, vengeful purpose. He wants to reclaim what he feels the world has stolen from him. The narrative tension eventually explodes in a series of violent and dramatic events. Linnet, pushed to her absolute breaking point by Horsberger's cruelty and the crushing pressure of the Church's expectations, finally makes a choice. She flees to Will. She chooses to live in what the world calls open sin, a life with the man she loves, outside the bounds of the marriage she was forced into. It is a defiant act of agency, but it's also a terrifying one, as she has essentially declared war on the social and religious laws that govern her existence. The resolution of the story is both violent and transformative. In a fatal confrontation in the village of St. Valentine, the threads of vengeance finally converge. Franz Linnet, having been cheated by a con artist, seeks vengeance and ends up in a deadly struggle with Andreas Horsberger. Both men are killed, removing the primary obstacles to Linnet's freedom through death rather than through the law. With Horsberger gone, the legal and social barriers that held Linnet captive begin to crumble, though the spiritual ones remain. The story concludes with a resolution that addresses the central conflict of the book, the clash between the indissoluble laws of the Church and the natural laws of the heart. Will, refusing to let Linnet live in a state of perpetual spiritual guilt, takes action. He manages to secure a papal dispensation, a rare and significant religious permission that allows Linnet to marry him legally and sanctified. In this way, their love is finally reconciled with her faith, allowing them to be together not just as lovers, but as a legitimate union in the eyes of both God and society. When we look back at Linnet, it's interesting to see how much it was a product of its time, yet how much it still speaks to universal themes. One of the most striking elements is the tension between idealism and realism. The book starts with the travellers looking for a pure Alpine life, only to find a world that is messy, modern, and deeply complicated. It's a critique of the way people often romanticize the other, or the simple life, without acknowledging the actual human complexities that exist there. There's also a very modern, almost cynical look at the commodification of art. Through Horsberger, Olin shows us how a natural, beautiful gift, in this case, Linnet's voice, can be turned into a tool of economic exploitation. Linnet isn't just a person, she is a gold mine. Her identity is stripped away and replaced by a stage name, a persona designed for consumption. Her journey from Lina to Signora Casalmonte is a study in how social mobility often requires the sacrifice of the self. But perhaps the most central theme is the conflict between religious dogma and what the novel calls the laws of the heart. This was a massive debate in the late 19th century, as traditional religious structures were being challenged by new ideas about individual agency and human rights. The book asks a difficult question: is marriage a sacred, indissoluble sacrament that must be upheld regardless of the human cost, or is it a social contract that can be superseded by true, transformative love? The resolution, the papal dispensation, is a fascinating way to handle this. It's a narrative device that provides a happy ending, but it also acknowledges the immense power of the institution. The characters don't simply ignore the Church, they have to work within its complex legal and spiritual machinery to find a way to be happy. In the end, Linnet is a story about the struggle for agency. It's about a woman who starts as an object of beauty and becomes a subject of her own life. She moves from being a girl who is acted upon by the men around her, the innkeeper, the suitor, the priest, to a woman who makes a definitive, even if painful, choice about how she wants to live. It's a romance, certainly, but it's one that is deeply concerned with the cost of that romance and the heavy weight of the world that tries to contain it.